I never thought repairing a sword could change the course of my life, until the alien queen's unexpected kiss made me question everything I thought I knew about duty, desire, and the strange gravity of the heart across worlds. The moment I stepped off the transport pod, the palace seemed to breathe around me, its walls shifting in hues of copper, violet, and molten silver, as though the very structure were alive. I adjusted the straps of my utility belt, already feeling slightly ridiculous in the formal uniform the liaison office had insisted I wear: white gloves, stiff jacket, and boots that squeaked faintly with every step. The ceiling arched impossibly high, and between the hovering light spheres, the air shimmered with a faint luminescence, like sunlight dancing through a prism, except the sunlight was green and smelled faintly of ozone. A sound hummed under my feet, subtle at first, then louder as I walked. The palace had its own heartbeat, or perhaps it was just the energy field surrounding the place. Either way, I was acutely aware that I was, in some very literal sense, walking into the heart of an alien queen's domain, and I wasn't entirely sure she wanted me there. I stopped short of the dais where she waited. The queen was not what I expected. Her skin was a vibrant green, luminous in the shifting light, and her hair was the kind of black that swallowed shadows whole, cascading over her shoulders in waves that defied gravity just enough to look deliberate. Her ears were long and delicate, tapering to points that flicked subtly as she observed me, twitching in ways that made me wonder if she was communicating silently with some hidden courtly network of attendants. She was tall, impossibly elegant, and utterly unreadable, yet there was something in her posture that made it clear she was curious, maybe even amused. I tried to remember the diplomatic handbook I had downloaded that morning, but it was mostly full of flowery, alien-specific salutations that made me sound like a complete idiot in my own language. I swallowed and muttered a quiet, "Well, here goes nothing," before stepping closer to the object of my mission. The sword lay upon a pedestal in front of her, an artifact that seemed to hum softly with an inner light. Its hilt was black crystal, engraved with intricate alien runes that glimmered faintly, and the blade itself looked as if a fragment of the night sky had been folded and sharpened. I couldn't stop myself from leaning in, examining the sword with a mixture of awe and fear. It was intimidating. I had repaired machines that could levitate entire ships, but a ceremonial weapon whose very metal sang to the touch was something else entirely. I bent closer, trying to keep my expression neutral, though a small, nervous laugh escaped me. "I promise I won't, accidentally cut myself," I said, because apparently the first words that left my mouth in the presence of a queen were the most foolish ones imaginable. Her eyes, a shade darker than emerald and impossibly reflective, tilted slightly, and I swore I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. A smile, perhaps, or a warning. Hard to tell with beings who had been alive longer than entire human dynasties. "That would be unfortunate," she said, her voice calm but carrying a soft vibration that made my chest tingle slightly. I coughed and adjusted my gloves. I don't normally handle things that hum back at me," I admitted, trying to sound casual, which in hindsight sounded more like a confession than anything else. As I set my toolkit on the nearby table, I noticed subtle currents of energy spiraling faintly along the floor, connecting the pedestal to the walls, pulsing like veins of light. Every time I reached for a tool, I hesitated, feeling as though the sword itself were judging me. I tried a joke. "Do I get points for using the right tool, or is this more like one of those tests where I fail unless I have psychic powers?" She tilted her head, ears flicking again, and for a moment I thought she might actually laugh. Instead, she hummed a sound that almost sounded like a chuckle. It was enough to make me grin nervously, which in turn made my gloves squeak as I fumbled with the fine instruments. The repairs themselves were deceptively complex. The blade was not just metal. It had energy conduits running within, tiny channels that carried glowing pulses like veins of light. Aligning them required a precision I could feel in my fingertips, a delicate balancing act between too much pressure and not enough. At one point, I tapped a tiny lever wrong, and a soft, violet arc of light jumped out, zapping my glove. I yelped and jerked back, nearly knocking over a hovering lantern. The queen's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, and then she laughed. A real laugh, musical and unexpected, like a wind chime ringing in zero gravity. "Careful," she said, a glint in her eye. "The sword is sensitive, but it seems you might be entertainingly clumsy." "Entertainingly clumsy is my specialty," I said, bowing slightly as if I were in a comedy skit rather than the palace of an alien monarch. "Most people pay to see me trip over things, though they usually don't involve interstellar artifacts." She tilted her head, long hair brushing her shoulders, and for the first time she stepped closer, moving with a grace that made me aware of every shift in my weight. "I will allow your clumsiness," she said, "because it seems honest." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in a palace where the light and air shifted with no predictable rhythm. I discovered the sword had mechanisms that could fold open and extend slightly, almost like it was alive, responding to touch, and each adjustment made it hum in a different tone. I joked about naming it, suggesting Sir Sparklepulse aloud, and she let out a soft exhale that sounded suspiciously like amusement. At some point, I realized I was speaking more freely than I ever had with anyone of any species, cracking jokes about my home planet's odd foods, my inability to brew tea correctly, and the strange rituals of human morning routines. The queen, meanwhile, allowed herself these tiny gestures of approval, a tilt of the head, a twitch of an ear, a glance that lingered just a moment too long. I caught her watching me adjust the delicate crystal layers, noticing the way the sword's glow interacted with her green skin and the black shine of her hair. I nearly dropped my wrench. "I swear I'm supposed to be professional," I muttered under my breath. Then came the final alignment, the moment when all the energy channels lit up perfectly, and the blade sang a pure, resonant note that filled the chamber. I straightened up, wiping sweat from my brow. "And done," I said, trying not to sound like a small child presenting a finger painting to the queen of an alien empire. She stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the starlight captured in the blade. For a heartbeat, I thought she might say something formal, something terrifyingly regal. Instead, she leaned forward, and before I could process it, her lips brushed mine in a brief, fleeting kiss. Shock froze me mid-motion, and I blinked rapidly, staring at her face, her ears twitching slightly as if she, too, were surprised by the audacity of the moment. The sword hummed between us, the energy pulses almost mirroring the wild rhythm in my chest. I couldn't speak. My mind scrambled for protocol, for etiquette, for anything that would make sense, but all I could do was stand there, flushed, awkward, and acutely aware that this single, impossible act had shifted something irreversibly between us. She straightened, gave me the faintest of approving smiles, and stepped back, letting the energy of the sword settle. Her gaze lingered, not harsh, not commanding, but curious, amused, and I realized with a start, not entirely indifferent. I exhaled loudly, trying to regain composure. "Well," I said, forcing a grin, "I guess that's one way to make a first impression." The queen's lips curved into another faint smile, the kind that held amusement, judgment, and perhaps a touch of curiosity. And in that moment, as I carefully restowed my tools and stepped back from the pedestal, I realized I had stumbled, joked, and fumbled my way into something far more extraordinary than simply repairing a sword. Something unpredictable, something fragile and yet thrillingly alive. And all because a queen with black hair, green skin, and impossibly elegant ears had decided to reward me with a kiss I would never forget. The hum of the palace seemed to settle, the light of the hovering spheres softening, and for the first time I allowed myself to laugh, a nervous, relieved, utterly human laugh. Somehow, in the most alien of places, with the most alien of rulers, I felt almost at home. and I had a sneaking suspicion that this was only the beginning. I spent the morning, or what felt like morning, in a place where time was more suggestion than fact, trying to convince myself that the Queen's sword wasn't sentient. Every time I leaned over it, the faint hum seemed to change pitch, almost as if it were reacting to my presence, or maybe judging my technique. The Queen, as always, hovered nearby, not in a threatening way but with that curious, half-amused expression that made me feel simultaneously scrutinized and strangely flattered. Her long ears twitched as she leaned slightly forward to watch me adjust a delicate energy conduit, and I tried to pretend I wasn't acutely aware of how her green skin caught the shifting light of the chamber. "So," I said, attempting casual conversation, "does it usually glow at this intensity, or am I just doing something spectacularly wrong?" My voice cracked halfway through, and I cursed softly under my breath. She didn't answer immediately, just hummed in a way that resonated through the floor. "The blade responds," she said finally, "to intent, precision, and perhaps nervousness." She tilted her head, the black cascade of her hair brushing past her shoulder. "You are inexperienced, yet attentive. That is acceptable." I swallowed and grinned, trying to recover some dignity. "Inexperienced, attentive, and dangerously charming," I added with mock bravado, and she raised one finely arched brow, her lips twitching just enough to betray the faintest hint of amusement. "Dangerous, you say?" she asked, voice silky but carrying a trace of humor. I was under the impression humans were mostly harmless, aside from their tendency to trip over their own feet. "Yes," I said, pretending to consider her critique seriously. "Mostly harmless, except when I accidentally vaporize the wrong panel on a Starship console. But that's very rare, like one time." I held up a finger for emphasis, and she let out a soft, melodious sound that made me instantly regret attempting humor, because it sounded like actual laughter, and I was never prepared for that level of alien amusement. The sword demanded my attention, however. Aligning its energy channels required a precision that bordered on obsessive. Tiny threads of light pulsed faintly along the blade as I adjusted the conduits, and I realized that each movement caused a subtle reaction in the surrounding environment. The hovering lanterns shifted slightly, the floor's iridescence rippled, and even the distant walls seemed to lean in, attentive. At one point, a conduit snapped back with a jolt of blue-white energy, sending a spark across the pedestal. I yelped, jumped, and accidentally elbowed a small hovering orb, which wobbled and zipped off like a startled insect. The Queen's ears flicked sharply, and she leaned forward, eyes glinting with humor. "You have a unique approach to delicacy," she said, voice tinged with amusement. "I do not believe the sword has ever experienced such exuberance." I grinned sheepishly. "Exuberance is my specialty. Usually it involves coffee spills, misplaced tools, or accidentally setting off the fire suppression system. But hey, the sword seems fine, right? Totally fine." The sword's hum deepened, resonating under my fingers as if it were chuckling along with us. I imagined it had a very dry sense of humor. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, and I became increasingly aware of the Queen's subtle attentions. She would drift closer as I worked, letting her fingers hover near the hilt, observing my method. At one point, she adjusted a floating console slightly so I could reach a particularly tricky conduit. "It is inefficient," she commented dryly, "to struggle so. Allow me to assist." Her hands hovered over mine, and I realized that this was not just guidance. It was an intimate proximity I was wholly unprepared for. I stammered, attempting a joke. "I swear I'm usually more coordinated. Or at least I only destroy things once per week." The Queen's lips curved in what could almost be called a smile, and I felt my chest tighten at the faint warmth of her amusement. "You are entertaining," she said. "Perhaps the sword enjoys your company more than I anticipated." I laughed nervously, trying to recover some composure while carefully aligning the last conduit. "The sword has excellent taste, apparently." My hands worked with careful precision, guided by a combination of training, instinct, and pure luck. The final connection hummed to life with a bright, resonant tone, and the blade pulsed in response. I exhaled, realizing I had actually managed it. The sword was whole again, its energy flowing cleanly, each pulse harmonizing perfectly with the palace's own hum. The queen observed silently for a moment, and then she stepped closer, her presence more immediate than ever. "It seems you have succeeded," she said, voice low, almost contemplative. And then, just as subtly, she leaned forward and brushed her lips against mine. It was quick, fleeting, and completely unexpected, but the warmth lingered, a spark that made my pulse spike in ways I had never experienced. I froze mid-breath, unsure whether to bow, apologize, or collapse from shock. She stepped back, long hair falling like ink over her shoulders, and there was a faint curve at the corner of her lips. "Do not be so rigid," she said softly. "Sometimes the outcome is more rewarding than the effort itself." My heart was hammering so loudly I was certain she could hear it. I tried to make a joke, anything, to reclaim some sense of normalcy. "Well, if this is what interstellar repair jobs usually include, I might have to reconsider my career choices." Her laughter, soft and melodic, filled the chamber. "This is not typical," she said, though I detected a teasing note in her voice. "But perhaps it should be." I smiled, suddenly bold, emboldened by both the humor and the intimacy of the moment. "In that case, I should probably start practicing. For future sword emergencies." She tilted her head, ears flicking slightly, and I imagined that somewhere deep in her mind, she was marveling at the absurdity of a human attempting charm in a palace that probably had rules older than stars. The rest of the afternoon passed in a curious blend of concentration and levity. I continued minor adjustments on the sword, though the tension had shifted from the fear of failure to the thrill of shared amusement. Each pulse of the blade seemed to sync with our laughter, our teasing remarks, and the occasional clumsy misstep. At one point, I accidentally knocked over a small container of fine crystalline dust that shimmered with static energy, and she caught it midair with a flick of her hand, ears twitching. "You are fortunate," she said lightly. "Most would have turned the chamber into a storm of sparks." I grinned, brushing imaginary dust off my jacket. "Luck favors the charming, or at least the absurdly clumsy," I said, earning another soft chuckle from her. The sound was hypnotic, grounding me, and I found myself moving closer without thinking, adjusting the sword with a newfound confidence. The hum of the blade pulsed in tandem with the rhythm of the palace, and I felt an uncanny sense of unity. Human, alien, and artifact connected in a delicate, improbable balance. By the time evening, or the closest approximation the palace offered, arrived, the sword gleamed under the soft, shimmering lights. I had cleaned, calibrated, and polished it until its edges captured and refracted the ambient energy in a cascade of soft colors. The queen observed silently, her gaze steady, appraising, and then with a tilt of her head she stepped closer once more. "You have handled this well," she said, voice carrying a faint, approving vibration. "Perhaps more than well." I dared a small bow, trying to meet her gaze without tripping over my own feet. "Thank you, Your Majesty. It was enlightening." I felt the absurdity of the words almost immediately, but she didn't correct me, only let the corner of her mouth twitch in that small, dangerous smile. Then, as if daring me to respond, she leaned closer again. I felt her breath, smelled the faint scent of something alien yet warm, and for a brief, electric moment, our lips met once more. It was brief, not ceremonial, not obligatory, but charged with something neither of us fully understood. When we pulled apart, the silence was not awkward. It was deliberate, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. I blinked rapidly, heart hammering, and attempted humor as a lifeline. "So, should I start carrying lip balm with my toolkit from now on, or is this a one-time perk?" She hummed softly, long ears flicking, and the faintest trace of laughter touched her eyes. "Perhaps it is best left Unpredictable, she said, voice low and musical, carrying just enough amusement to make my chest swell. The sword rested between us, a perfectly aligned marvel of alien craftsmanship, and in that pulse of light and resonance, I realized something remarkable. A simple act of repair had become a bridge, spanning species, culture, and the quiet, growing curiosity between two beings who had no reason to trust, yet found themselves drawn together in laughter, accident, and an unexpected intimacy that neither protocol nor logic could fully explain. As I carefully restowed my tools and stepped back, I caught the Queen watching me, ears flicking in a rhythm I was slowly learning to read, and I felt a strange, thrilling certainty. This was only the beginning of a story that would be absurd, delicate, humorous, and extraordinary all at once. With a sword that hummed, a queen who amused herself with human clumsiness, and a human who had somehow, improbably, survived the encounter with dignity intact. By the time the following day arrived, or the palace's version of morning, I had developed a slightly unhealthy respect for its sense of time. It seemed to stretch and contract like a living membrane, and I had no idea whether we were minutes, hours, or centuries into this particular sequence. Still, the Queen was patient, moving through the halls with her usual calm grace, letting me accompany her as if I were, well, some mildly amusing domestic anomaly she had decided to keep close. The sword, now gleaming perfectly, rested in a suspended cradle of energy behind her, its hum soft but constant, almost like the heartbeat of the palace itself. I felt it in my chest, a resonant rhythm that reminded me with each pulse of how far I had come. "Today," she said, voice low and melodious, "you will learn that service is not merely the application of skill but understanding." She tilted her head, letting her black hair tumble over one shoulder as her green eyes studied me. "And sometimes, understanding involves patience and a willingness to endure the unusual." I tried not to swallow audibly. Endure the unusual. That was pretty much my life at this point, wasn't it? I smiled and muttered, "I can endure. I come from a species that considers walking into a coffee shop without tripping over your own feet a remarkable accomplishment." She hummed softly, an almost approving sound that made my chest tighten. Her ears flicked forward, a sign I had learned meant curiosity, though whether it was benign or mischievous was impossible to tell. "We will begin with the ceremonial inspection," she said. I nodded, trying to look confident while internally bracing myself for whatever interstellar etiquette awaited me. The inspection turned out to be less about ceremony and more about demonstrating familiarity, respect, and a willingness to engage with a culture utterly alien to me. I had to handle other artifacts, realign energy conduits on minor ceremonial devices, and explain, without tripping over my tongue, how human mechanics could integrate with alien engineering. Every misstep earned a soft hum of amusement or a teasing glance, and I realized with a mixture of pride and terror that I was enjoying it. At one point, I leaned too close to an energy conduit, and a small pulse of violet light zapped across my glove. "Ow, okay, that's electrifying in a literal sense," I said, waving my hands. The Queen's ears flicked sharply and she tilted her head, hiding a smirk. "You endure well," she said. "You are amusing even in minor calamity." I bowed, nearly knocking over a levitating crystal orb. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I've been practicing the human art of graceful chaos. You seem impressed." By midday, the formalities began to give way to more personal interactions. The Queen allowed me to walk beside her as she moved through the palace gardens, suspended platforms with bioluminescent plants, and hovering water globes creating a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere. I tried joking about how I could never get my own plants to hover, and she chuckled softly, a sound that made the air between us feel charged with something unspoken. "Your world is amusing," she said, "and chaotic. Perhaps that is why it is invigorating to interact with you." I raised a brow. Invigorating? I'm flattered or terrified. Sometimes those two go hand in hand. Her lips curved slightly, but she said nothing, letting the observation hang like a delicate bridge between us. The sword, of course, was never far from our attention. I noticed that it reacted subtly whenever we laughed together, tiny pulses of energy shimmering along its edge. The queen caught me watching and arched a brow. "Do you think it enjoys humor as much as you do?" she asked. I shrugged. "Either that or it's laughing at me. Honestly, sometimes I'm not sure which is worse." She hummed, an alien sound that somehow felt approving, and I realized that between the humor, the minor shocks, and the strange intimacy of shared purpose, a bond had formed. Not merely of duty, but of mutual trust and understanding. Later, we sat in a chamber filled with softly floating holographic globes, each displaying distant star systems in minute detail. She had allowed me to examine some of her personal data, strategic, cultural, and oddly poetic. "These are my observations," she said, almost shyly. "I trust you not to mock them." I laughed softly. I would never. "Although I have to say, your notes about interstellar weather patterns are oddly dramatic." She gave a small, genuine laugh this time, and I felt a thrill at having elicited it. "Drama is necessary," she said, "even in science." The day stretched onward, filled with small adventures. Recalibrating a hovering security drone that had been acting sulky, aligning a crystalline light conduit that threatened to discharge if mishandled, and navigating a minor dispute between two of the palace's more temperamental energy spirits. Through each task I discovered a rhythm, one part careful technique, one part improvisation, one part humor, and one part connection. The queen watched, teased, guided, and sometimes let me fail spectacularly, her amusement always tempered by patience. I realized I had grown. I was no longer simply a human thrust into an alien palace. I had become someone capable of engaging, adapting, and even inspiring amusement in a queen who had existed for centuries. As evening approached, the palace light shifted to a softer, warmer glow. The queen led me back to the hall where the sword rested, humming faintly in anticipation of some final acknowledgement. She watched me as I approached the pedestal, her gaze steady, her green skin glowing in the ambient light. "You have handled these tasks with a skill and humor I did not anticipate," she said. "It seems that a simple act of service can lead to unexpected rewards." I realized she was speaking not only of the sword, but of our interactions, of the delicate dance of trust, humor, and connection that had unfolded over the past day. Rewards like minor shocks, sarcastic remarks, and mysterious kisses. I asked, trying to inject levity into what I sensed was a serious moment. She hummed, and for a heartbeat her black hair brushed over her shoulder, ears flicking in amusement. "Perhaps," she said softly. The final task involved a calibration sequence that required the sword to resonate perfectly with the palace's energy matrix. As I adjusted the final conduit, the blade pulsed brighter than ever, casting ribbons of color across the walls. The queen stepped closer, close enough that I felt the warmth radiating from her, and without warning pressed her lips to mine once more. This time I was ready, not with practiced humor, but with a heart open to surprise and connection. The kiss lingered just enough to convey trust, recognition, and something tender that defied protocol, before she stepped back, allowing space for both of us to breathe. I realized then how much I had changed. I had arrived as a nervous, awkward human, unsure of my place and terrified of missteps. Now I understood the value of patience, humor, adaptability, and connection. I had learned to navigate alien technology, interstellar etiquette, and more unexpectedly, the fragile yet thrilling intricacies of human, alien intimacy. The palace no longer seemed intimidating. It felt alive, responsive, and most surprisingly welcoming. The queen studied me one last time, ears flicking in that rhythm I had learned to read, and she allowed a small smile, one that carried both approval and quiet amusement. "You have done well," she said, "perhaps more than well." I bowed, not out of fear but respect, and allowed myself a grin. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I've learned more than I imagined, and I admit I'm glad to have survived your sword, your humor, and your rewards." She hummed, and I thought I caught the faintest flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Perhaps," she said, "our journey is only beginning, but for now it seems all is well." I took a final glance at the sword, gleaming in the ambient light, resonating softly with the pulse of the palace. I realized it was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of trust, connection, and the strange, delightful chaos that could exist between two beings from entirely different worlds. I felt a surge of gratitude and amazement. I had entered as a simple human tasked with a repair. I left as someone who had touched, however briefly, the life of an alien queen, discovered the strength of humor in the gravest of places, and felt the astonishing vulnerability and thrill of unexpected intimacy. As I walked beside her toward the exit of the chamber, the palace humming gently around us,